Okay, guys. For this week, we're gonna discuss anti-takeover measures. So this is gonna be the um, kind of important part when we try to understand the merger acquisition process. Because previously we were just talking about the big things, but now we're gonna take a step into the merger process and look at the interaction or like the battle between the acquirer and the target. So, because I mean, it's a battle because in this process, we are talking about millions or billions of dollars of transaction, right? So different parties are in this process and different parties has different interests in this process. For example, like we discussed earlier, in the merger process, shareholders, they want the best offer, right? So for example, if you are a shareholder of a target company, you want the best offer from the acquirer. But but then managers, they have different incentive. So managers, they want to keep their job, right? So I mean, as long as the company is not sold, the job is secure. Right? So in that case, they don't really care how much shareholder. I mean, I'm not saying like at extreme, but in many cases, they don't really care how much shareholder receive, but they really care about their own job. Right? So this is a different interest. But then acquire, on the other hand, they want to buy the target, right? They wanna because I mean, based on different kind of merger incentives, right? For example, there could be synergy, there could be manager talent, there could be value improvement, there could be like vertical integration incentive. Right? All these incentives are behind the acquirer's motivation to buy target firm. So they want to buy the target firm. And of course, they don't want to buy, they don't want to pay, they don't want to overpay. Right? So now you can see different parties in this process have different incentives. Therefore, in this topic, we're going to look at the incentive of target company, especially target managers incentive here. And I mean, from the name, from the title, you can already, I mean, guess what we are going to talk about, right? We are going to talk about target managers when they're trying to defend, when they're trying to fend off the merger acquisition attempt from the acquirers. What measures do they take? These are called anti-takeover measures, right? When we talk about these measures, they are on two levels. The first level is on the legislation level, and mostly they are state legislation. The second level is on the firm level. Right? So the way to think about this is that in the 1980s, and then mostly in the 1980s and early 1990s, different states in United States, they have adopted different anti-takeover laws. And I mean, there are first generation anti-takeover law, there are second generation anti-takeover law. So this is on the legislation level, right? So and the reason is because in 1980s, I mean, we know from the topic one in 1980s that it's the period where we have the hostile takeover merger wave. Right? So this is the 1980s is characterized by a wave of hostile takeovers, right? And because of the occurrence of the hostile takeover, because of the popularity of the hostile takeover, different public firms they're trying to lobby the state legislature to enact legislation that can help them to kind of prevent acquirers from acquiring the target company, right? It's because reason. I mean, it's reasonable because at that time, hostile takeovers, most of them they are very kind of disturbing for the target management. They could cause disruption to the normal businesses of the target firm, and that's not good for the target shareholder wealth. All right, so that therefore firms want to lobby government to enact such legislation to help them prevent the acquisition attempts. All right, so this is kind of an idea. Now the second level is more kind of long run. It's more decentralized. So it's the anti takeover provisions adopted by firm, right? Of course, some of the, actually many of the anti-takeover provisions, they are pioneered by the legislation in the 1980s. But after that, there are kind of different ways from the shareholders to kind of install the anti-takeover provision or to kind of push back the anti-takeover provision, right? Essentially because anti-takeover provision has the pros and also has the cons. It's like double-edged sword, right? So that's why in recent years, right? I mean, you can think about, in recent years, many shareholders and many, for example, shareholder activists, they're trying to push for less and less anti-takeover defenses. I mean, and also more importantly, they're pushing for more use of, they are pushing more regulated use of anti-takeover measures at the firm level. So what does that mean? That means that they are pushing for shareholders vote, shareholders say in the adoption of anti-takeover defenses, right? So this is kind of way to think about this topic. We're gonna start from um, the first generation state anti-takeover laws, and then we look at the second generation, and then we're gonna spend most of the content this topic on the firm level defense tactics. So what is first generation state anti-takeover law? That basically it was started by the first one was adopted by Virginia. And the historical background I have already talked about. It's because in the 1970s, 1980s, there are many hostile takeovers, right? And that spurred the development of efforts to kind of lobby government to pass those legislation to protect those firms. And the first generation anti-takeover law, the main problem is that they only apply to firms that did only a small amount of business in that state. And the other characteristic of first generation anti-takeover law is that they're very strong against the takeover. In other words, they protect very strong protection over firms that are likely to be acquired. So until 1982, firms in Massachusetts and 37 other states, they were covered by the first generation law. But in 1982, realizing that the protection provided by the first generation anti-takeover law is too much, to provide too strong protection to the firms that are yet to be acquired, the first generation anti-takeover law was effectively invalidated, right? By this very famous U.S. Supreme Court decision in Edgar versus Might Corporation. So this court decision marked the end of the first generation anti-takeover laws. Right? But it doesn't mean so. So here's the tricky part. So the first generation anti-takeover laws, they were effectively invalidated, right? But it doesn't mean that subsequently some provisions from the first generation anti-takeover law were, so it doesn't mean that all provisions from the first generation anti-takeover law, they were disappeared, right? Some provisions from the first generation anti-takeover law, they were actually evident in the second generation, right? And till now, they are still there. But the main characteristic is that these laws provide managers with unusually aggressive defenses against unwanted takeover bids, right? And we all know, we know what will happen if you protect managers too much, right? It's because when you protect managers too much from takeover bids, right? It's gonna generate manager entrenchment because they are free from external pressure to improve the firm, right? Because if you have the takeover threat, right, you're gonna improve your performance. You're gonna do your job because you know that if you do not do a good job, maybe one firm is gonna acquire you and then you will lose your job, right? But if you have this very strong, aggressive defenses installed there, then you are kind of very, you are kind of enjoying your life, right? Because you know the legislation is there to protect you, so you don't have to do a very good job. Let's look at the four components of first generation state anti-takeover law. The first one is the bidders are required to file disclosure statements with the state security commissioner, and then they need to send the copies of the disclosure statements to the target company, right? And the disclosure is very, very detailed. Second one is it allow holding the tender offer open for longer periods than required by federal law under the 1988 Williams Act. So that essentially means tender offer we talk about in the first topic, right? So whenever acquire, so tender offer means that the acquirer directly send the offer to the target shareholder without asking the target management. So that essentially means that when an acquirer sends a tender offer to the target management doesn't have to answer, doesn't have to reply to the tender offer in the specified deadline in the letter. So the target company can when they hold a tender offer letter, they can extend it for longer periods than required. Right? So I mean, this is not good news for acquirer because usually lengthy tender periods will increase the bidder's expected costs in the negotiation process and increase the probability of competitive bids. Right? So that significantly increase the cost of acquiring the target company from bidder's perspective. The third component is that the target company could demand a hearing with the commissioner to seek an injunction to delay the tender offer. Right? So again, this is beneficial for the target firm, right? So because it says that the target company, they can actually get legal support, right? So they can demand a hearing with the commissioner, right, when they get an offer. They don't have to respond to the bidder right away, right? And people usually find that the state elected officials, they will be more likely to on the side of the target company, right? So that means if the bidder is coming from outside of the state and then they approach the target that is incorporated into that state, then target company gets more kind of support from the legal side, right? And then this is also not very good because that delays the process of bidders, right? And we know that in the merger acquisition process, speed is very important, right? Because the stock price is changing from time to time, right? So if the process is delayed, then that means that increases the uncertainty of the bidder's offer, right? So that might actually force the bidder to pay more in the future. So that is the cost. Finally, the bidding firm are liable for damages arising from the takeover offer, right? That's also very, very strong, aggressive defenses against takeover because the target company can say there are like the following damages. For example, the bidder CEO sends the target CEO an tender offer letter, right? So which causes the target management to spend more time thinking about the offer, so they don't have time to devote to the normal routine operation of the firm, right? So which causes certain damages, right? But who knows, right? So this can be one of the damage that the target company can claim in the court, right? So now you can see this is really aggressive defense against takeover attempts, right? So this paper by Gerald and Bradley in 1980, right? They find that the takeover premium actually increased significantly after the imposition of the first generation law, right? And because this first generation law protected the target company too much, right? Immediately after this my decision from the court, right, which invalidated the first generation takeover law, states began adopting second generation anti-takeover law, which are more reasonable, right? And at the same time, firms are also beginning to adopt new firm level takeover defenses, right? So now you can see they are all, I mean, at the same level. And since 1982, so Ohio is the first state to pass the first kind of second generation anti-takeover law, which is called control share acquisition law. A total of 43 states have adopted at least 157 second generation laws. And so again, the second generation law, they also have main four components, which is called the fair price provision, business combination provision, control share provision, and a cash out statute. So first of all, the fair price provision. The fair price provision requires that in a successful tender offer, all shareholders who do not decide to sell will receive the same price as shareholders who do accept the offer. Right? So what does that mean? That means in a tender offer, right, there are shareholders who accept the offer first, and there are shareholders who do not accept the offer, right? So who will delay. And this is typically called two-tied bids, right? Or two-tied tender offer. So in that case, if you are the shareholder, you haven't decided on whether to sell your shares to the acquirer or not, right? So you haven't decided that yet, right? And then this fair price provision requires that as a bidder, you have to pay an equal price to the shareholders who decided first to sell to the bidders, right? Remember in topic one, we say that there is a tendering problem, there's a holding problem, right? Which means that the minority shareholder might not be willing to sell the shares to the bidder, right? So then in that case, the bidder or the bidder or the tendering shareholder, they might have the right to ask the minority shareholder to make some concession, right? But this fair price provision says that you cannot do so, right? So all shareholders of the entire company has to receive the same amount. This typically happens in two-tied tender offer, right? So basically in two-tied bids, the high price is offered to the first-tied tenders, right? And the low price or less advantageous terms, right, are offered to the members of the second tier. Right? So there are two tiers, and different tiers they have different treatment. Right? And then the second treatment usually is the one that received a worse treatment. So this fair price provision clears this issue. Right? So this is the fair price provision. The second one is the business combination provision. So this provision prevents business agreements between the target company and the bidding company for a certain period. So essentially, it allowed to hold the document, hold the agreement for a certain period. And then this is designed to prevent leverage hostile acquisition. Right? So usually when an acquiring company assumes a large amount of debt to finance takeover, it might be relying on the sales of assets by the target to pay the high interest payments, right? So that needs more time. So then if it's this case, right? If it's like the acquirer needs to wait for the target to sell some assets to pay off the high interest payment, which usually happen in the leverage hostile acquisition. So which means acquirers borrow money to acquire a target, right? So if that's the case, then this legislation actually says the acquirer cannot do that. And so again, this eliminates some of the benefits of acquire in doing this kind of acquisition. Then another provision here is called control share provision, which is the control share law passed by Ohio in 1982. Right? So some states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they have it, but others like Delaware, they do not, right? Basically, a control share provision requires that acquiring firms obtain prior approval of current target shareholders before the purchase are allowed. So this again increases more costs for the acquirer, right? Because as an acquirer, if you wanna purchase the company, you have to get approval from target shareholder, which means there's more kind of cost you have to bear, right? Because it's a lengthy process then. And these provisions typically apply to stock purchases beyond a certain percentage of the outstanding stock. Usually it's 20%. So it's, I mean, if you can check the topic one. Topic one, we say that normally for merger acquisition to be to require shareholder approval, it's 20%, right? So that means acquire needs to use at least 20% of the share, right, in acquiring the target. And it is particularly effective. This provision is particularly effective if the current share ownership includes large blocks of stock that are supportive of management, right? So the idea is that but here we are talking about target management, right? So essentially that means that if the target management is against the takeover, they don't want the merger acquisition to happen, right? Now what they can do is that if you have a control share provision that says you need to essentially get a shareholder approval, right? But what are the biggest shareholder approval of the target company in this case, right? It's the target management, right? So then target management can easily say no, to the merger acquisition, right? Which can block the takeover attempts by the acquirer. But this provision actually has pros and cons for the bidder, right? So on one hand, it's bad, right? If you have a company that if you have a company that is where the management is against you, right? Then in that case, you have to engage in this very costly process to persuade the target shareholder, right? But it's also good because it gives you the hint, right? Hint about the possibility of the bid in the early stage, right? It's almost like the early referendum on the possibility of a bid, right? If you already get lots of resistance, right? So that already tells you that maybe it's not a good time to do this acquisition, right? So that's why it's a double-edged sword, right? So it has pros and it also has cons, right? Another kind of potential benefit for the acquired company here is that, I mean, sometimes target companies shares, they are mostly owned by target management, right? So in most cases, but in other cases, it could be that they are owned by uh, target shareholders, right, who are very friendly to the acquirer, right? So in that case, bidder might actually like this provision, right? So they might actually welcome the vote, right? So in that case, I mean, if shareholders, for example, if you make a tender offer, right, and then if you make a tender offer, you make a very attractive price, very attractive offer to the target shareholder, right? So this is good. The target shareholders, they like your offer. Now, in that case, you might actually like to have the vote, right? Because if the vote says that target shareholder welcome the merger acquisition, welcome the tender offer, now you can use that as an excuse to push the target management to approve it, right? You can say, no, your shareholder like it, right? So you need to approve the merger, right? So now that's why it's a double-edged sword. Finally, cash out statute, right? So this is designed to limit tender offers, right? So basically, it says that if a bidder buys a certain percentage of stock in the target firm, the bidder is then required to purchase all the remaining outstanding shares at the same terms given to the initial purchase, right? You have to purchase all the shares at the same price term. Now again, this increases the cost of acquisition, right? And that also provides or imposes limits for the acquiring firms that lack the financial resources for the 100% stock acquisition. Right? For example, if you use cash to buy the first 10% of the stock, right? You cannot say, oh, I want to borrow money to buy the rest of 90%. You have to give the same price term, right? And you also need to pay the same price, right? So I mean, you pay $5 per share for the first 20%. You have to use that price for the rest of 80% shares as well, right? So this limits the leverage acquisition, just like I said, right? So if you have a leverage if you have a leverage acquisition, meaning that you borrow, right? If you borrow money to buy, right, then that is also limited by the cash out. Right? So basically, it might require the bidder to assume an even greater amount of debt with the associated high debt in front of you. Right? So because I mean you have to acquire all the remaining shares in using the same term. So that means you have to borrow more. Right? So now you can see um, this is the kind of the four components of the second generation law. And we're gonna talk about a little bit about the Delaware anti-takeover law because Delaware is very special because in U.S. One half of the all public firms that are incorporated in Delaware, right? So, and 63 of the Fortune 500 firms are incorporated in Delaware. Right? So, one of the reasons why public companies like to incorporate in Delaware is because Delaware has a well-developed body of law, right? It also has a very sophisticated court system. I mean, they pioneered very kind of modern corporate governance regulation, which help protect shareholder rights. Right? So that's why, I mean, many public firms, they prefer to incorporate in Delaware. Of course, another reason is the incorporation fees are also cheaper in Delaware. Right? So, and this paper by Babchak and Cohen, they find that having an anti-takeover law in place was an important factor in state incorporation decision, right? So because of this anti-takeover law, firms like to incorporate in Delaware, right? And actually the Delaware anti-takeover law was late in adopting, right? It was adopted in, I think around 1996 or 1998, right? Sorry, 1980, 86, 89. So basically the law stipulates that an unwanted bidder who buys more than 15% of the target company stock might not complete the takeover for 3 years, right? Except the bidder has satisfied the following condition, right? First of all, if the buyer buys 85% or more of the target company stock, that's the first condition. Second, if 2/3 of the shareholders approve the acquisition, right? Again, this is very costly, this is very stringent requirement. Finally, if the board of directors and the stakeholders decide to waive the anti-takeover provisions of this law. Right? So this is basically the Delaware anti-takeover law, right? Which is very demanding for the acquirer, right? And also this Delaware anti-takeover law is designed to limit takeovers financed by debt. Right? So again, I mean you have to buy 80% or more of the target company stock, right? So that's a very high percentage, right? I mean, if you are leveraged and you want to buy the firm, that means you have to borrow a lot, right, to finance this 85% purchase. That's why it was designed to limit takeovers financed by debt, right? Now let's look at the wealth effects of anti-takeover laws, right? This paper by Karpov and Malatesta in 1998, what they found is that they found a small but significant decrease in the stock prices of companies incorporated in the states contemplating passage of such laws. Right? So there's a stock market price decrease, right? And they also find that the companies doing significant businesses in these states also suffer a decline in the stock prices, right? So that seems to suggest that shareholders do not like the fact that there is an anti-takeover law, right? So because shareholders might be worried that because of this anti-takeover law, this gives protection to the public company managers protection, yeah, and this protection might be excessive, right? In the sense of that managers might not, because of this protection, managers might not want to exert their high efforts to improve the firm performance, and this can cause manager entrenchment. Right? Another paper by Kalman and Schwartz, they find that the laws did not significantly deter takeover. This is what they find. And then they find that the effects of the laws and the poison pills serve to enhance the bargaining power of the targets, right? So this is another important finding. That is, it doesn't change the takeover likelihood, but conditional on you have the acquirer approaching you, right? You are involved in the acquisition process, conditional on that, right? You will be able to receive a higher price terms, right? So again, it's because you create lots of deterrent to the acquirer, right? So that's why acquirer wants to pay more to clear those deterrents, to clear those resistance. And more findings on this, right? So Bertrand by Molin-Neston, right? This paper in 2003, they found out after the passage of such laws, both blue and the white collar wages went up, right? And especially the white collar wages go up, right? So it's because this law actually protects firms being taken over, right? And then because one of the negative consequences of merger acquisition is that there are layoffs, there are wage cuts, right? So remember, one of the synergy firms claim is that there's cost reduction, right? So, I mean, part of the cost comes from wage cutting, right? So in our case, if you have anti-takeover law, that means firms are more protected from anti-takeover threat. That means employees are more protected from anti-takeover threat. Sorry, workers that are more protected from takeover threat, right? So in that case, the wages might increase, right? From their welfare may become better, right? And the other thing they found is that the operating efficiency was lower in the post-passage years, right? So again, this supports this managerial hypothesis, which is because managers, they are insulated from external pressure following the anti-takeover law, they choose to live a quiet life, right? This is called a quiet life hypothesis. Another finding is that by Giraud and Muller, 2010, is the operating performance deteriorated after the passage of these laws in less competitive industry. That's again because quiet life, right? And also the market correctly anticipates these effects, right? So now, basically, if you have less takeover threat, that means your manager slack might increase, right? Because manager have nothing to fear here, right? No, in that case, maybe if you are in a more competitive industry, that might help, right? Because competition can potentially help reduce manager slack, right? But if you are in a less competitive industry, then your operating performance might deteriorate, right? Finally, this paper by Kane, McKeon, and Solomon find that a greater takeover protection with associated with lower firm value. Again, it's because of the manager entrenchment. And this protection also is associated with higher takeover premiums. Right? So now we're going to look at the firm level takeover defenses, right? And the firm level takeover defenses, again, there are two kinds of ways to think about the firm level takeover defenses, right? On one hand, you have manager entrenchment. On the other hand, you have shareholder interest. Now, there are competing hypotheses when we think about firm levels adoption of takeover defenses, right? One is the manager entrenchment, like I just talked about. That is, shareholders, they'll experience reduced wealth when managers take actions to deter attempts to take control of the corporation. That is when managers adopt anti-takeover measures, right? And this is because anti-takeover measures help protect managers from doing their job, from improving the firm, right? So this is bad news. Then another hypothesis is the shareholder interest hypothesis, which is shareholder wealth increases when manager take actions to prevent changes in control. So this is because when managers take action to prevent changes in the control, right? That might actually be good news for shareholder, right? Because sometimes sometimes being taken over is not the best choice, right? Sometimes operating as an independent company can maximize shareholder value, right? And also, if you have anti-takeover defenses, right, that can save the cost in preventing takeover attempts, right? That is cost saving. So if you have this, if you think about this cost saving, shareholder interest might actually be consistent with managers adopting the takeover defenses, right? And the other reason why that there's a good reason to think about and the adoption of anti-takeover measures is that the takeover defense, the anti-takeover measures, when they are adopted, they can improve offer terms, price terms, right? So again, this is the same as we saw earlier, right? Conditional, you getting the offer. Having anti-takeover measures, having takeover defenses can improve the offer terms. So basically, if you have these two hypotheses, we can basically test these two hypotheses, and many papers that have tried testing these two hypotheses. So, for example, if you look at installation of a given defense, and you find that the client shareholder wealth, then it supports management entrenchment. Otherwise, it supports shareholder interest. This paper by Mark Schleifer and Vishny find that a company's Tobin's Q increases as the ownership stakes increases, right? And this is because if you have greater ownership coming from managers, right? That means the managerial interest and the shareholder interest, they are converging, right? So which is the convergence of interests. That is because many companies, they actually give top managers inside ownership, right? Basically, in order to incentivize them to improve the company, right? Because their incentive in that case are more aligned with shareholder because they are shareholder themselves, right? So what they find is that shareholder, when the ownership stakes increase, which means the managerial ownership increases, Tobin's Q increases, right? So their paper provides weak support for the shareholder interest, interest hypothesis. So which is when a shareholder, so when a manager's incentives are more aligned with the shareholder, it is valuable for the firm. And so it's not kind of quite relevant in the anti-takeover measures in the sense of takeover defense, but it provides you one way to think about shareholder interest, right? Which is to align the incentive of shareholder interest with those of shareholders. And when we talk about firms' adoption of anti-takeover measures, we need to think about the board's rights to resist, right? So whether it's legal for board of directors to resisting hostile bids, right? To kind of prevent external acquisition attempt. Basically, U.S. laws, they give the board of directors of U.S. company much leeway in resisting hostile bids, right? So it is legal for this company to fend off the acquisition attempt. And they're actually part of director's fiduciary duty, right? Because the fiduciary duty says that if you feel like, for example, operating a company as independently, not taking the acquisition offer, right, is the best choice for the shareholder. You need to do this, right? You need to make sure that the takeovers, you need to kind of prevent those takeover attempts. You need to make sure that the company has not taken over, right? So in that case, it might actually be the best interest of the shareholder to have a anti-takeover measures installed, right? But in other jurisdictions, the laws are more shareholder oriented. In other words, shareholder rights, they are more powerful. Right? So managers cannot resist, cannot use that many anti-takeover measures to resist acquisition attempts. Now, if you think about adoption of takeover defenses, that also changes in different life cycles of a firm, right? In the initial post-IPO years, right, takeover defenses, the adoption of takeover defenses, they can solidify the bond between the company and the important stakeholder, like customer, supplier, and employee, right? So this might actually be good, right? So the takeover defense might actually make the relationship between shareholder and stakeholder stronger. Right? Now, over time, that might actually be a problem, right? So that might actually be the evidence of manager entrenchment, etc. Right? For example, there are studies who find that valuations of a company were higher when they had more than 3 defenses in place. Right? But only if the company reported it had at least one large customer. Right? So which suggests that takeover defense is a way to strengthen the company's relationship with the customer. Right? Because when a merger acquisition happens, customers' interests are also might be affected, right? So that's why the anti-takeover defense might actually be in the interest of customer as well. Now you can see one of the good things about takeover defense is that it can strengthen the ties between a company and its customer supply. Another study by Johnson, Kapov, and Yi, they find that on average firms had 2.42 defenses in place when it's IPO, right? And then this average increased by an additional 0.67 defense during the next 10 years, right? But of course, like I said, the value implication for anti-takeover defenses changes through the lifetime of a firm, right? So initially, it could be because it could be that it is shareholder value increasing, right? It might actually be good for shareholder, but over time, it might actually reflect management entrenchment, right? And there are two kinds of anti-takeover measures. One is preventive anti-takeover measures, which is you don't have an acquisition attempt yet, right? So there's the preventive. The other is called active anti-takeover measures, right? So this is when you do have a acquisition attempt, you do have a takeover attempt there, right? So you need to take active measures. Now, in the early stage, right, before anyone approaches you, before any bidder makes any acquisition offer, makes any request about acquisition, there could be early warnings. For example, usually a merger acquisition is started by accumulating stakes, right? So then by tracking the trading pattern of a company, you may actually see some clues about potential bidder trying to acquire you in the future, right? So if you find a sudden and unexpected increase in trading volume, that might actually tell you that there might be a bidder who's trying to accumulate shares before having to announce the intention. Right? And there's a regulation by SEC, right? So which requires that if a public company, so if you want to acquire 5% or more shares of a public company, right? You have to report or register with the SEC within 10 days, right? So in other words, if you're the investor, your holdings of a company crosses the 5% threshold, you need to file a Schedule 13D 10 days later, right? So this can definitely help you to identify who's accumulating your company stocks, and perhaps that guy is the potential bidder, right? Potential acquirer. And there are two types of preventive anti-takeover measures. One is poison pill, the other is corporate charter amendments. Right? And they are basically for the same purpose, basically. Right? So poison pill is very famous anti-takeover defense, right? So it was invented by Martin Lipton, so which is a very famous MA lawyer. It was used in 1982 by him, right? Because he's the lawyer in the merger acquisition deal, right? So it was used by him to defend El Paso Electronic against the General American Oil, right? And again, he used it in 1983. So at that time, there was a deal between Brown-Forman versus Lennox takeover contest, right? So he actually used used the poison pill twice in these 2 deals, right, initially. But it was first used in this El Paso Electric against the General American Oil, right? So initially it was just preferred the stock plan, right? So, but it was adapted in 1985 by using the rights instead of a preferred stock plan, right? And then these rights allow the holders to buy stock in the acquiring firm at a lower price, right? So basically, basically in this 1983 merger, right? This lawyer, Martin Lipton, he suggested that Lennox offer each common shareholder a dividend of preferred shares, right? And this preferred shares will be convertible into 40 shares of Brown-Forman stock, right? If Brown-Forman, this acquirer, takes over Lennox, right? So it's anti-toggle defense. It's an anti-toggle measure because if these preferred stock are converted, they will seriously dilute Brown family's 6% share ownership position. Right. So that means if you have a big kind of shareholder in the acquiring company, then if you have this poison pill that allows the target to basically target, if they have this poison pill, they can actually buy stock in acquiring firm at a low price, right? So that dilute the ownership of the manager of the big shareholder in the acquiring firm, right? So I'm actually de-incentivize them from buying a firm. So this is the first 2 versions of poison pill. And in this version of, this 1983 version of the poison pill, there's a typical triggering event that might actually trigger the adoption of the poison pill, right? So basically, a typical triggering event could be one of the following, right? For example, an acquisition of a percent, for example, 10% or 20% of the outstanding stock by any individual, partnership, or corporation, right? That is the 10%, 20% threshold. As long as someone is trying to acquire more than 10%, then that's a warning signal. Another triggering event is that if there is a tender offer for 30% or more of the target company's outstanding stock, right? That's another triggering event for the poison pill. And this first generation poison pill is usually called the flip over poison pill, right? Because there are 2 features about this flip over poison pill. The first feature is that it allows the holder to buy stocks buy shares at a discount, right? Basically by acquiring firms' shares at a discount, right? Second feature is that it is only effective only if the bidder acquires 100% of the target. Now you can see that is also the kind of disadvantage of this poison pill, right? If I buy 99% of a company, I cannot activate this poison pill. And so only when the bidder acquires 100% of the target, this is effective, right? So that's why it's limited. Now, the more kind of modern or kind of newer generation of poison pill is called a flipping poison pill, right? This flipping poison pill basically allows the holders to acquire stock in the target company at a discount, right? Basically, the flipping rights, which is what I just talked about, the flipping poison pill, they were supposed to dilute the target company, right? And this is regardless of whether the bidder merged target into his company, right? So even if it's like 60%, 60% ownership by the acquired firm, right? It's not like 100% change of control. That can still be activated, right? That's the good part. Now, historically, in 1990s, the poison pill defense were very common, right? Because in 1980s, there are lots of hostile takeover. In the 2000s, there are pressures coming up against the companies, right? So basically the shareholders want the company to not renew poison pill plans and to not adopt new ones, right? Because they worry that that might lead to manager entrenchment. Right? And basically, you can look at this graph, right? So this is the number of poison pills that adopted from 1983 to 2016. Yeah? Now you can see in the 1990s, that was a peak. But in 2000, it becomes smaller and smaller. Right? But in late 2000s, there's another peak. But then again, it is less than popular over time. And then this graph shows the US incorporated poison pills in effect, right? But in general, you can see the number of companies that use poison pills are decreasing, right? But of course, just looking at the number of poison pills might actually be a little bit misleading in the sense of if you just, there are many shadow poison pills, right? If you look at a document, you look at a company's let's say charters, you might actually not able to, you might not be able to discover them, right? Which is called shadow pill. That is the target, they might simply adopt a pill after the bid has taken place, right? Or when the activist has targeted a firm. That's what's called a shadow pill. That's why you cannot really detect it if there's no acquisition attempts, if there's no bid taking place, right? This institutional shareholder services, right? So this is a third-party company, consulting company for shareholders. Basically, they provide advices on corporate governance issues. This institution has pressured company not to adopt plans longer than 1 year. Right? So basically, they don't like companies adopting poison pill for more than 1 year. Right? And also, they encourage a company to secure shareholder approval before the poison pill is adopted. Because to adopt poison pill, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily need shareholder approval. Right? So that's why the ISS, they encourage firms to, or encourage shareholders to have this process in place. That is, whenever the manager wants to install a poison pill, they need to get approval from shareholders, right? To make sure that they don't abuse the poison pill. Now, who issues poison pills, right? So basically, they're issued by company to common shareholders, right? And then they are issued like a dividend of one right for each share of the stock they own, right? And then the right to purchase one share of preferred stock of a issuer during the exercise period. That is what poison pill is, right? So it's like a right. And also they trade with the stock, but they are not detachable until a distribution date, right? Which is typically a triggering event, right? For example, if there is an offer made by the potential bidder, that is a triggering event. So in that case, the poison pill might be issued, and then everyone that has the poison pill will be able to buy the stock, buy the shares at a discount, right? And of course, the key thing here about key feature of the poison pill is that the bidder does not get to enjoy the benefits of the rights. Right? So the bidders cannot buy the shares of the target at a discount. Only the target shareholders can. Only other investors can. Right? Now, the other important component here is the 50% off prices, right? So, for example, when a bidder closes on the purchase of the target shares, right? So then the holder of this poison pill, they are able to buy the shares of the target company only by 50%, right? Only half of the price. Now let's look at one example that illustrates the mechanics here. Suppose that there's a company A that tries to make a bid for company B, and then the target has a poison pill. Right? Now let's assume the target company, which is here, which is company B, right? Let's assume that this poison pill has exercise price of 60, and the target stop price now here is $10, right? The stop price of company B is $10. So now in this case, the number of shares that can be purchased here is 60 divided by 10 divided by 2, right? So why do you want to use 10 divided by 2? Because because this 50% off, right? If you have this right, you have the right to purchase target shares at a 50% discount, right? Now you can see if you have this poison pill, you are able to buy company shares, right? You're able to buy 12 shares of the company stock. Now suppose there are 1,000 shares outstanding before the bid, and then the bidder has purchased the 200 of them. Right? Now in that case, the poison pill allows each of these 800 shares to be used to purchase 12 new shares, right? So for example, the existing shareholders who hold those 80% can purchase 12 shares. Now for each of the shares, they're going to purchase 12 shares, right? Now in total, they'll be able to purchase 9,600 shares. Then in that case, the total share outstanding will be 9,600 plus 1,000, right? That's the total amount of shares after poison pill has in place. And in that case, the value of the target's equity before the poison pill is 10 times 1,000. Right? And total equity capital here is 58,000. Right? And in that case, the per share equity value is going to be 5.47. Right? So in that case, the loss of the value of the shares to the control shareholder is $10 minus 5.47, right? Which is 4.53, right? So in that case, if we can further calculate the percentage of the control shareholder before after the poison pill, right? I mean, you can think about that as a bidder, right? So before the poison pill, they own the 20%, right? After the poison pill, they only own 1.89, right? So this is a very strong kind of evidence that they actually dilute bidders' ownership in the target company. Okay, so let's recap. I just talked about the poison pill mechanics. So let's go through the example again. So assume the company A makes a bid for company B, and then company B has a poison pill, right? And then the poison pill has exercise price of 60. Well, the target company stock price is 10. And because we have the 50% off condition, which is this poison pill enables the rights holders to buy target company shares with a 50% discount. So in that case, the number of shares you can purchase if you have this poison pill is 12 shares, right? 12 shares per share. Yes, 12 shares per share of the poison pill. Right? That's the idea. Now, suppose you have 1,000 shares outstanding and 200 of them, they are from bidders. So bidders have already purchased 200 of them. So in that case, the poison pill allows each of the 800 shares to be used to be purchased 12 new shares, right? So they're all together, they are 1,000 plus 9,600, which is 10,600 shares. Right? Now, the value of the equity before the exercise of the poison pill it doesn't change. It is still 1,000 times 10. Right? Now, what is the total equity capital here? The total equity capital here is basically 10,000. That's the value of the target equity before the poison pill is issued. Then when the poison pill is issued, the total equity is 60. That is the exercise price of the poison pill times 800. So 800 is the number of shares for the poison pill. So altogether, it's going to be 10,000 plus 48,000. So the total equity capital is 58,000. Right. So this is the total equity. Right now, how many shares do you have in total? You have 10,600 shares. So that's why the per share equity value is 5.47. Now you can see initially, if you do not have the poison pill, so your price is $10 per share, right? Now that's why the loss of the loss of the value of the shares is 4.53, right? And if we calculate the percentage, if we have the percentage terms, so if we calculate the percentage ownership of the control shareholder, or in all cases the bidder's ownership, initially it's 20%, right? So 200 shares divided by 10,000 shares. Now it's going to be 200 divided by 10,600 shares. Right? Now you can see substantially the ownership goes down, right, from 20% to 1.89%, right? So that is the idea. And basically, directors, they can quickly authorize the poison pill without formally requesting shareholder approval, right? So and then again, poison pill has pros and cons. They can enhance shareholder value in terms of when there's really an offer coming in, they can offer us the price. They can improve the offer term. They can also entrench manager in the sense of they protect too much protection to the manager, so that's why manager do not have the external threat. So they don't want to improve the firm in that case. So in that case, another kind of poison pill here is called the chewable pill. Chewable pill allows for the shareholder votes on whether the particular takeover bid will be covered by the company's poison pill. Right, so that is more targeted. And next, we talk about other kind of anti-takeover measures. I mean, most of them are actually related to how easy a company's manager, a company director can use poison pill. For example, blank check preferred stock. So what is blank check preferred stock? Blank check preferred stock essentially is that a board of directors, they might have authority to issue rights, right? But the ability to issue shares is dictated by the corporate charter, especially when you issue a poison pill, right? Now, in that case, in order to be able to issue shares in a more kind of easier way, which is you don't have to go through the shareholder approval process. In that case, the board of directors, they might amend the articles of incorporation, which is basically charters, to create and reserve a certain amount of the preferred stock, right? That could be used as poison pill. You know? And if board of directors, they are successful in amending the charters in this way, they can avoid potential delays in seeking shareholder approval, right? So in that case, it's easier for them to use poison pill, to install poison pill. Now, poison pill can also be deactivated by the target board of directors, right? Because board of directors, they can redeem, in other words, the poison pill. Now, in that case, if it's just board directors' decision, then bidders, they can try to use the feature to offset the poison pill by initiating a tender offer that is contingent on the removal of the pill. All right, so I can, if I were the bidder, I can say, I give you this tender offer, but to make my tender offer effective, you need to remove the poison pill. Yeah? Now, there are three kinds of provisions, right? Basically give the power to redeem the poison pill to directors. So because directors, they have the power to deactivate the board of directors, to deactivate the poison pill. In that case, these provisions, they can provide the rights only to the director that issued the poison pill, right? For example, dead hand provisions give the power to redeem the poison pill or to deactivate the poison pill to the directors who were on the target board who were on the target boards when the pill was adopted, or who were appointed by such directors. So the ultimate right to deactivate a poison pill goes to those directors who actually installed it. Yeah. Now you can see it will be very difficult, right? For example, I mean, if in order to do that, you need to get approval of that particular director, right? And that particular director might be against the merger. In that case, it will be very difficult. to remove the poison pill. Basically, many court decisions they actually rule that such provisions will render the proxy contest impossible, right? Because I mean, the only way to remove a poison pill is through a particular director, right? That's what makes the proxy contest impossible, because in that case, shareholder they cannot file a proposal to remove the pill, right? On the other hand, it also forced shareholder to vote for the incumbent director, right? As those directors would be the only ones who would redeem the pill. Right? I mean, if you do not vote for the incumbent director, right? Again, you cannot repeal the director. Now you can see this provision actually forced the shareholder to vote for these directors who actually have the right to redeem the pill, right? They can only vote for these director. And there are two variations of this dead hand provision. One is called slow hand provision, which places a limit on the time period when only prior director can redeem the pill. There's also no hand provision, which limit the period for redemption to a certain time frame. In general, there are studies that look at the impact of poison pill on shareholder wealth, right? For example, Malatesta and Walkling, they find that poison pill defense reduced shareholder wealth. Yeah, so supporting this managerial entrenchment hypothesis. And they also find that the managerial ownership was less for firms who adopted poison pills, right? Which seems to suggest that if you have less management ownership, that means managers' interests are less aligned with shareholders, right? So this is where the kind of conflict of interest happens, right? And Georgeson is a consulting company. They conducted a study on the poison pill. They find that the premiums paid to pill protected companies are actually much higher than those without pill protection, right? So this points to the bright side of poison pill, which they can improve the price terms of the offer, of the acquisition offer, right? Because in order to remove the poison pill, you have to offer more, right, to please the shareholder, to kind of persuade the directors. In general, the kind of consensus from this research is that the implementation of poison pill defenses tends to be associated with negative, although not large, excess returns to the target stock, right? Which suggests that that signals that managers might be entrenching the company, right? So might be getting private benefits instead of maximizing shareholder value. But we need to keep in mind that given that there is a merger acquisition attempt, given that there is an offer, poison pill, they can actually improve the shareholder wealth, right? So that's why it makes it very balanced. So it's a balanced view in terms of poison pill. Now you can see, because board of directors have very strong influence in the process of adopting and redeeming the pill. That's why managers, they may also adjust the structure of corporate boards in order to prevent against merger attempts, right? So, and sometimes the combination of a board structure with poison pill can be very powerful defense, right? So in that case, if the bidder believes that it can influence, it can replace the target board in order to remove the poison pill, then this poison pill defense is not very kind of powerful, right? I mean, they can just, in the director election, if they can replace the board of director, then it might be easier to kind of remove the pill. But if you have a staggered board in a company, that makes it very difficult to change the entire board, right? In order to replace them. So we will talk about staggered board in a little bit. Here we're going to look at corporate charter amendments for a bit. So this is another preventive anti-takeover defenses, right? So basically, bylaws and charters, there are two kind of corporate documents, and then bylaws that are usually established by the board of directors, and they set forth important rules, for how the company will operate. For example, they'll indicate when directors meet and when and where the company's annual shareholder meetings will be, right? I mean, it will talk about this information. But a corporate charter is a more fundamental document that sets forth the company's purpose and the different classes of shares it might have, right? Now, in this case, in order to change the articles of incorporation, in order to change the corporate charter, you need a shareholder approval. But in reality, so here's the reality. The reality is that it is often very, very easy for managers to persuade shareholders to vote with them if the managers want to change corporate charters. And another thing with corporate charter is that shareholders, they cannot initiate changes to corporate charters by themselves, right? So only the managers, they can initiate changes to the corporate charters, and then shareholder, they can put a vote on it, right? Now you can see actually, even if the shareholder needs to vote in order to pass the change to your corporate charter, it's nothing, right? Managers, they can persuade the shareholders very easily to approve the changes to the corporate charter, right? And then shareholders, they cannot actually initiate changes to the corporate charter themselves, right? So why it's easy to persuade those shareholders? Because most of the shareholders in US, they're actually institutional investors, right? And institutional investors in general, they actually sided with management. All right, so that's why it's easy to persuade those shareholders to vote with management. And here, the changes in the corporate charter, they are very common anti-takeover devices. And there are four major changes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So, like I said, the majority of the anti-takeover charter amendments are approved. So, I mean, it's actually because the majority of charter amendments, they are approved. Research on amendments of charter in general points to negative effects following their passage, right? Because it's so easy for the managers to change the amendment. So it could be that the managers are changing the charters in order to kind of provide themselves with greater private benefits. There are four major amendments. One is staggered board, so staggered term of board of directors, right? The second one is supermajority provision, and then fair price provision, and then due capitalization. Now, a normal director election process provides that each director they will be elected every single year, right? On every single year's annual meeting. Yeah? Now, when a board is staggered and classified, in that case, each director, they are up for election every 3 years, right? In other words, only 1/3 of the board directors will be up for election every year, right? And then in all states, if you want to installing a staggered board through amending the corporate charter requires both shareholder board approval. But as I said, it is actually very easy for the manager to do so. Basically, historically, in the early 2000s, the majority US public companies, they actually had staggered boards. But during the years following 2000s, many public companies, they have followed the recommendation of the Institutional Investor Services, and shareholders have pushing them to changing to a unitary board, to declassify the board, right? Basically, the idea is that because in a staggered board, like we just talked about, right? Because board of directors, they have strong discretion in adopting or repealing the poison pill. That's why bidders might want to replace the board. But if you have a staggered board, it takes 3 years to replace the entire board, right? Which is very costly for the acquirer, which is almost impossible. In that case, if you have a combination of a poison pill and a staggered board, actually is very powerful defense combination, right? I mean, because it is almost impossible to remove the pill in this case, right? And this paper by Babchak et al., they find that having a staggered board nearly double the likelihood that a target remain independent, right? So So that's how powerful stagger bot is, right? So this is the graph that shows the historical trend of stagger bot. You can see over time in general, stagger bot becomes less and less frequent. Basically, under Delaware law, classified directors, which are director in a stagger bot, they cannot be removed before their term expires, right? But in other words, so in other cases, non-classified board members, they can be removed by majority voting. That's why stagger bot, like I said, it's a very powerful way to prevent a acquire from buying the target, to kind of deactivate the poison pill, for example. So it could be very powerful. And there are a couple of studies who look at the shareholder wealth effect of stagger bots. In general, they find a negative relationship between firm value and the implementation of stagger bot, right? Recently, there are papers who find that stagger bot actually is good for innovation firm because stagger bot actually help prevent short-term oriented attacks on firms with a more long-term orientation, right? Because board of directors, I mean, the average election is like 3 years, right? So that's why board of directors, they can sit on it for a long time. So it helps cultivate this culture of long-term orientation in the firm. The second amendment is supermajority provisions, right? So this essentially provides for a higher than majority vote to approve a merger, typically 80%, right? So this provision actually is more powerful, it's more effective when management holds a sufficient amount of internal stock, right? So in that case, for example, management and employee stock ownership plan holds 22% of the outstanding stock, right? And the employees are in general very loyal to the company, to the management, right? Now the company's charter requires 80% approval for mergers, right? So which means you have a supermajority provision for a merger. In that case, it is very difficult to approve the merger, even if the merger needs approval, right? Because you can see you can see the supermajority voting requires that 80% of shareholders vote for the merger, right? But 22% of them almost cannot vote for the merger. In general, supermajority provisions contain escape clauses, right? Which allow the corporation to waive the supermajority provision when it comes to a merger. So that's a more kind of balanced supermajority provision. So basically, corporations they usually enact supermajority provision together with other anti-takeover charter amendments, right? Because it will be more powerful, simply because, right? Because if a supermajority provision requires supermajority to amend a corporate charter, then it will be again very difficult to kind of erase the other anti-takeover provisions, right? Because you need 80%, right? Now again, shareholder wealth effects. Basically, this first couple of papers, they failed to find significant negative price effects. But Jarrett and Post in 1987, they find that for later supermajority provisions, which included such escape clauses, they were associated with statistically negative returns. Also, which essentially ties the supermajority provision with the merger, right? So which makes merger less likely, right? So which signals that managers might entrench themselves by having a supermajority provision to make mergers less likely, right? So that they're insulated from external takeover threat. And supermajority provisions without escape clauses did not show significant negative returns, right? So basically, these supermajority provisions with escape clauses so build a relationship between the merger and a supermajority provision, right? Basically, it installs a supermajority provision when it comes to merger approval, so which makes the merger less likely. And the fourth one is dual cap, right? Dual capitalization. This is a restructuring of equity into two classes of stock with different voting rights. We also call this kind of firm called dual class firm, right? Dual class firm had two classes of shares, right? So the idea is that one share of the stock gets higher dividend but has no voting rights. The other share of the stock has not much dividend but it has stronger voting rights. The idea is that the first class of the stock, which has more voting rights, is given to the managers, to the insiders, right? The one with less voting rights but with more dividends are given to the shareholder, right? Basically, it is to give greater voting power to a group of shareholders that favors managers, right? Like insiders. For example, News Corp, in which the Murdoch and his company hold Class B shares, right? This Class B shares command 39% of the company's voting power, right? And even if it's only like 40%, like 60% of the equity base of the company is Class A shares, right? But these shares, they do not have voting rights, right? They might receive a high dividend, but they have no voting rights, right? So this means that managers can have their discretion to decide on corporate matters, right? Even if when it comes to merger approval, right? Shareholders cannot vote, right? Because all the shares that have voting rights are with insiders, are with guys that favor managers. So why do these kind of dual class recap get approved, right? So because it seems very unfair for the shareholder, right? Because shareholders of closely held companies, right? These companies with very concentrated ownership in these insiders, they're trying to raise capital while preserving control, right? They need the shares, they need more shareholders, but they don't want to kind of unleash the control of the company to shareholders. For example, in 2007, Snap Incorporation did an IPO where the founders retained 38 of the voting power, right? While only owning 45% outstanding shares, right? And actually, this kind of dual class share is very common among technology companies, right? Because for technology company, for innovation company, the managers, they do need to establish the stability, right? They cannot allow shareholders to come in and say, we want to replace the manager from time to time, right? Because this is not very good for long-term innovation, right? And the idea is that shareholders, they can get a gain from high dividends from the class of shares, but they actually might not value control that highly, right? So research, they show that companies that pursue dual class recap seem to do better in some ways than leveraged buyout firms. For example, these dual class firms might actually have more capital expenditure, right? Might do more investment in innovation, for example. Right? Recently, shareholders, they have put this pressure against company adopting the dual class share. Again, these are the wealth effects, right? You can take a look at dual class shares. Another amendments companies can do in face of in face of takeover threat is through fair price provision, right? This is similar to the fair price like legislation that we talk about so that's part of the second generation anti-takeover law, right? But this is a decentralized firm level defense, right? So firm can choose to adopt this or not. So basically, it's a modification of the charter that requires the acquirer to pay minority shareholders at least a fair market price, right? Again, it's the same idea. And shareholders must receive at least the maximum price paid by the acquirer, right? When he or she buy the holdings, right? So again, this is quite useful in a two-type tender offer. And again, they find a small but insignificant wealth effect for these fair price provision amendments. Another two kind of tactics are called anti-greenmail provisions and restriction to call an election. So anti-greenmail charter amendments, they restrict the ability of a target company to pay greenmail to a potential hostile bidder. So the idea here is that sometimes hostile bidder may come in and talk to the target management and say, we have acquired a certain amount of shares in your company, right? in order for us to not approach you again to buy you, to not buy you, you need to repurchase the shares at a higher premium, right? So now you can see this is almost like a grain mail payment, right? And the anti-grain mail charter amendments essentially forbids the company from doing so. And the restriction on ability to call an election, right? So sometimes the best way for the bidder to gain control of the company is to kind of have the annual meeting as a forum, right? And then they can persuade a shareholder to approve the merger, to kind of push for the idea that the company needs to be sold, right? Now, in this case, company can amend the charter to limit the ability to call meetings, right? So that these buyers, those raiders, they find it difficult to kind of persuade shareholders to approve the merger. And also, there are other ways, for example, changing the state of incorporation, right? So this is, some states, they might be, the kind of state legislation, they might have state anti-takeover laws that are very kind of aggressive defense against acquiring firms, right? So then firms might want to reincorporate in those states, right? But usually people do not find a significant wealth effects. The second component of anti-takeover defense is the active anti-takeover defense, right? Where you actually, when you do have bidder making an offer or kind of acquiring many shares of a target firm. These defense tactics include the green mail, right, which is share repurchase of a bidder's accumulated shares in the target at a premium, right? With this one, we just talked about this one. The second one is standstill agreement. And by the way, this first way, it's more used in the United States, but it almost disappeared in current MA market. The second one is standstill agreements, where the bidder agrees not to buy additional shares in exchange for a fee. Right, so you can sign this. I mean, this is very common in these days. Target usually signs with a standstill agreement with the bidder, right? So that the bidder agrees not to buy additional shares of the target company. And another tactic is called white knights and white squares, right? So where the target might actually seek a friendly bidder as alternative to the hostile acquirer. And another one is called capital structure changes, right? In this case, targets might take actions to change the capital structure, essentially to make the target more leveraged, right? To prevent a merger, right? Essentially, the idea is that to make the company less attractive for the bidder, right? So that bidder walk away. Right? And also like litigation, right? For example, targets they commonly sue the bidder, right? And the bidder often responds with a counter suit, right? Basically, they will sue the bidder saying that the bidder disrupts their normal operation. And then, for example, Pac-Man defense, and also just say no defense, right? So these are other defense tactics that you can take a look. So standstill agreements, they are agreement where the would-be acquirer agrees not to increase its holdings in a target during a particular period. Right? For example, during a negotiation period, usually the target company doesn't want the acquirer to acquire more shares because during the negotiation, target stock price may actually increase, right? Now, if you acquire target shares from time to time, then target shareholders can actually suffer from that, right? Because it's not fair for target shareholders, right? Because the stock market increase is not reflected in the offer price. And they're designed to prevent shares. I mean, these standstill agreements, they're designed to prevent these shares from falling into the hands of another bidder who would force the target to pay them standstill compensation or take over the target. Right? Because in many cases, the bidder who actually has like, let's say 10% of the target company, right? They might actually not find the target very attractive and walk away. Now, if they walk away, they have to sell their shares to another bidder, right? Now, if they sell to another bidder, then another bidder may actually force the target to pay the standstill compensation, right? For example, I mean, the target doesn't want another bidder to buy those shares, right? So in that case, the target may actually need to pay them standstill compensation, right? Now, if you sign a standstill agreement with the current acquirer, then the current acquirer, they will agree not to increase the holding. Right? They may also agree that they don't want to sell to another bidder. Right? And this standstill agreement is often coupled with a non-disclosure agreement, which is the bidder cannot disclose anything, any confidential information they learned from the negotiation process to other bidders. Right? And this is to make sure that information exchange will not be used to further hostile bids, right? If friendly negotiation fall apart. And then the second defense is white knights and white squares, right? So white knights basically means that the target company can seek the help of a white knight, which is another company that would be a more acceptable bidder for the target, right? So then the white knight will make an offer to buy all or part of the target company, right? In that case, this will give a more favorable terms than the original bidder, right? It might kind of scare off the original bidder. And in general, what researchers find is that competition has a negative effect on shareholder wealth of the bidding firms, right? So essentially what they find is that if in a merger acquisition there's a white knight, essentially the original bidding firm, right, is worse off, right? Because if they ultimately buy the target firm, they have to pay much more, right? A similar defense tactic is called white square, right? So in the white square defense, the target company will try to implement strategy that will preserve the target company's independence, right? In this case, the white square is a company that agrees to purchase a large block of the target company stock, right? And they are given incentive to do so. For example, such incentive include like a seat on the board, or like a favorable price on the shares, or promise on general dividends, right? So this is almost like I pay some money to get the other company to buy my shares, right? So and then the other company, they hold larger stock of my shares, so that the kind of bidder will find it very costly to buy the shares of my company. And the classic example here was Carter Holy Hill's sale of convertible preferred stock to the General Cinema Corporation. Right, so there CHH uses this Y square defense. You can take a look, see what happens. So this is on the book. And finally, there are also merger agreement provisions, right? Like lockup transactions, termination, breakup, and topping fees, no shop and go shop provisions. So first of all, lockup transaction, right? So lockup transaction, it is similar to a white square defense, right? In this lockups, the target is selling assets to a friendly third party instead of stock, and it makes the target less attractive. In many merger agreements, it might include lockup options. And then this lockup options is the option to buy certain assets or stock in the event of a change of control. Right, so basically it says that when there's a merger acquisition coming in, the target will be selling assets to another party, right? And usually these are the assets that the acquirers really want, right? So now in that case, acquirers might not want to buy the target anymore. In some cases, this is invalid. For example, in the case between Revlon versus Pantry Pride, right? In this law case, which you can take a look in the book, the court says that the use of the lockup option is invalid, right? And second is termination fees, right? Termination fees, they usually occur when a target agrees to compensate a bidder if the target company is taken over by a third party, right? And it's about 2% to 3% of the purchase price. And the largest termination fee of all time with the 4 billion paid by the AT&T when it tries to acquire T-Mobile but failed. So this is the largest termination fee. Basically, this paper by Officer 2000, they find that there is an average increase of premium of 4% when the bid featured termination fees. Right? So that increased the premium. And Bates and the Lemon 2000, they find out takeover premiums for firms with termination fees was 3.1 much higher, right? So because the idea is that in order to prevent, the idea of having this termination fee is that the target is trying to talk to the acquirer, say, if I don't find your price attractive, I will pay you this, and then I will sell myself to another bidder, right? So this already signals to the acquirer that the price that the acquirer pays might not be sufficient, right? So that's why acquirers in those cases will pay even more to kind of prevent this kind of situation from happening. And termination fees, in some cases, they could be a source of capital to finance an expansion strategy. All right. So, for example, I buy a acquirer, right? So I buy a target. The target finally refuses to be sold to me, right, and pay me a termination fee, and then I can use this termination fee basically to kind of finance my investment strategy, expansion strategy into, for example, the target industry. Right? And the other related defense tactic is called reverse termination fee, right? Reverse termination fee allow the buyer to walk away from the deal after the merger agreement has been reached. So in this case, buyer needs to pay target the termination fee. And these clauses become popular in 2005, right? Because in 2005 and 2006, right, there are many private equity deals. So basically, this reverse termination fee enhances the financing out clauses. So what is financing out clauses? These are the clauses that allow the private equity buyer to walk away if it cannot get the necessary financing, right? Because for private equity buyers, they have to borrow money to buy the company, right? So it will be very likely that they cannot secure the necessary financing. And so this is the termination fees in the bidding process, right? So this process we talked about in the first class. Basically, the termination fee is determined when the takeover is announced, right? Basically, when the bidder and the target, when they are negotiating the deal. Finally, you can also have no shop and a go shop provision. So no shop provision says that the target, the seller, agrees not to solicit or enter into negotiation to sell another buyers, right, after the merger is publicly announced, right? So this is a defense tactic because the target company might actually try to reach such agreement with a white knight or with a third party, and then use it to resist the negotiation with the hostile bidder. Right? So the target company can say, oh, I have a no-shop provision with another party, so I cannot talk deals with you. I cannot be acquired by you. Right? The example is the acquisition between Paramount Communication versus the QVC. So in that case, they have another white. They have another white where Paramount Communication has a no shop provision with, right? You can Google this transaction and look at the details. There's also the go shop provision. So go shop provision basically says that after the merger negotiation, after the merger is publicly announced, the acquirer gives target, let's say 14 days, right, to go shop, right? So to go find the best offer ever. If within, let's say 14 days or 10 days, target cannot find, then the deal is done, right? This is to reduce the probability of a lawsuit from a shareholder, right? Because in the first topic, we say that a shareholder has the appraisal rights, right? Which is they are not satisfied with the price the bidder paid, right? They may actually sue, they may actually file a lawsuit with the court saying that the bidder need to pay more, right? But this provision says that the target, their board of directors, they can go and find other bidders who can offer a better price, right? If they cannot find a better price, then these shareholders cannot sue the bidding company, right? Because I mean, there's no better price, right? There's no better price that other company can pay. Finally, capital structure changes, right? So basically, this is when a target company try to make the target company less attractive, right? By assuming more debt, issuing more shares, or buy back shares. So assuming more debt, like issuing more bonds, um, issuing borrow more from the bank, right? Issuing more shares, including general issue or white square, right? So sell some shares to another company, and also employee stock option plan, right? So because employees, they're generally very loyal to the management, right? And also buyback shares, right? Like self-tender, open market purchase, and targeted share repurchase, right? Just this is try to reduce the potential shares that acquirer can buy. So when a company is recapitalized, basically it increases the debt, basically, right? So in many cases, they will increase the leverage from 20% to 70% usually, right? And it substitutes most of the equity for debt while paying the shareholders a large dividend, right? And this recap idea was pioneered in 1985 by the multimedia with the assistance of the investment bank of Goldman Sachs, right? They have two advantages. The first advantage is that it allows the company to act as its own white knight, right? So it's like the company acquires it by itself, right? Borrows money, buy the equity, right? It's almost like buying itself, right? Second advantage is that it might give management a greater voting control in the target following the recap, right? Because the management uses the financing to buy the equity, right? That's why management or insiders will hold more of the company after the recap. And many recap, they require shareholder approval. So what about the shareholder welfare, right? So again, it depends on the purpose of recap, right? If the purpose of the recap is to increase shareholder return, then the shareholder wealth tend to be positive, right? And defense recap, for example, recap when used to fight against a merger, they usually generate a substantial amount of cash, right? Because they borrow money from the bank to finance to buy the equity, right? And this cash, they can be used as alternative to the offer from the hostile bidder. So meaning that it can use, I mean, the target company can use the cash to buy the shares from the hostile bidder, right? And this paper by Dennis David in 1995, they find that 31% of the 29 recap encounter subsequent financial distress, right? Of course, right? Because you borrow a lot to increase the leverage, of course, you might have the chances of future financial distress. Now, assuming more debt, right? So this is just similar to recap, right? So basically, just to make the company more kind of less vulnerable to a takeover, right? Because if you have a low debt to equity ratio, that means you have lots of shares, right? Then it is very easier for outsiders to buy your shares, right? That's why you will become more vulnerable to a takeover. And in that case, the hostile bidder can use the borrowing capacity to finance the acquisition of the target. And in this case, the target can fight off the merger attempts by borrowing from the bank, right? And another option is to issue more shares, right? Issuing more shares increases equity while maintaining the debt level. In this case, the target company make it more difficult and costly to acquire majority of the stock for the bidder, right? So this is another tactic. On the negative side, it might dilute shareholder equity, right? So usually the market reaction is negative. And this is one example by Gucci, right? Gucci issued more shares as a defense against hostile bid by LVMH group. Right? Finally, buyback shares, right? Another way to prevent the merger is to buy back the shares, right? Basically, it can divert shares away from the hostile bidder and if you buy back shares, right? And if these share repurchase they are financed with debt, right? They can also benefit by using some of the target unused debt capacity, right? Now in that case, the target again will appear less attractive to the bidder, right? Again, bidder acquire they always like company with low debt to equity ratio. They don't want a debt, right? But federal regulation, they limit the ability of a target firm to repurchase the shares after it receives a takeover offer. So in that case, one solution in this case is to use targeted share repurchases, right? So I will just say I will use this repurchase to do what kind of thing, right? Or this repurchase is basically uh, used for what purpose, right? So this is like targeted um, repurchase. So this is the buyback shares alternative, right? And finally, they can use litigation, right? I mean, the target company they can sue the bidder saying that, oh, the offer you made has disrupted our you have disrupted our normal operation, so I don't want your bid, so I want to get compensated. So this is the defense tactic that usually uses, right? So basically, the litigator, they can request that the court grant an injunction that will prevent the takeover process from continuing, right? Then this temporary halting of the takeover, it will delay the acquisition process, right? And then the longer the process is, the more costly it is for the bidder, right? So basically, the solution that we talked about earlier, so this one, the targeted share repurchase, this is essentially it takes the share out of the hands of those who would most likely sell them to the hostile bidder, right? So this is what is a targeted share repurchase, right? So basically, they will try to repurchase from the hostile bidder, right? So in that case, the acquisition attempt will disappear, right? And let's come back to the litigation, right? So litigation and the grounds of injunctive relief, right? So this is the period that the merger negotiation is haunted, right? This might provide a necessary time to allow a bidding process to develop. So another major benefit is to give the bidder to raise the offer price, right? I mean, maybe the target doesn't want the bidder because they think that the bidder current price is too low. Now in that case, it will, if they sue the company, right, sue the bidder might actually try to increase the offer price, right, to kind of impress the target shareholder, to kind of persuade the target shareholder. This was actually used by Oracle's acquisition of PeopleSoft. I mean, next time we can talk about briefly about that case, but that's what used by, so basically Oracle originally made a hostile bidder to PeopleSoft, but PeopleSoft management sued Oracle. Now, after the lawsuit or during the lawsuit, Oracle have increasingly increased the offer price. So this is an advantage. So the research in this aspect, they find that litigation occurred in 1/3 of the all tender offers, but there's no significant price effect. So because litigation in this case, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because it increases the chances that the bidder quits from the merger process, but target company might also suffer from major losses, right? For example, it could be that the target company, it could be that it will be the best interest to sell the target company to other bidder, but the lawsuit process prevents other bidders even approaching the target, which is not good. And in this process, the bidder might actually walk away, right? So finally, it might not be at the best interest of target shareholders, right? So this is the kind of general consensus, right? Litigation might bring benefits, but if the bid is actually withdrawn, or when the acquirer walks away, actually it will result in significant losses, right? So finally, we have gone through so many anti-takeover provisions, right? But what are the most important ones, right? So this paper by Karpov, Charlotte, and Welly, 2020, right? So this very new paper, they find that only 11 of the 24 G-index provisions are robust and negative related to takeover likelihood, right? So what is G-index? Basically, G-index is developed by this paper in 2003, right? They constructed G-index to capture the shareholder rights, and these 24 this 24 governance rules actually include many of the anti-takeover defense tactics. So this paper, they find that 11 anti-takeover measures, they are most effective in reducing takeover likelihoods, right? For example, anti-green mail, blank check, classified board, director contrast, director indemnification, limits on director liability, director duty provision, executive severance, fair price provision, supermajority vote requirements, and unequal voting rights. So these are the 11 that are most related to, the most effective in reducing the takeover likelihood. So next time, when we do the live session, I will briefly I'll briefly summarize what you talk about today. And this is so much for today's class about the anti-takeover